The summer Lydia Vale turned 23. Dry Bell had almost no water left to argue over. The creek behind the church had sunk into a brown line between cracked banks. Dust lay thick on the wagon road. Even the horses stood with their heads low, too tired to stamp at flies. Lydia stood outside Elder's Supply, with her hands folded in front of her and 40 people watching. Her father stood beside the credit board. Ephraim Vale had owned a store once. Not a large one. Not a rich one. But enough that people in Dry Bell had treated him like a man worth listening to. Now, the shelves were gone. The windows were boarded. And the only thing he still carried like property was his daughter. Frank Elders, who ran the supply store, held a small scraping knife in his hand. He did not look comfortable. "Do it," Ephraim said. Frank glanced at Lydia. "Maybe this could wait." "It has waited long enough." The credit board hung beside the store door. Every family in Dry Bell had a line on it. Harrow, Crane, Bellwether, Pratt, Vale. Chalk marks showed what each house owed. Flour, salt, lamp oil, feed, sugar when times were better. Lydia's name had been written beneath her father's after she returned from the Harrow place. Widow returned. That was how people said it when they were being polite. Failed wife was what they meant. Ephraim pointed at her name. "She is no longer under my credit." The crowd made a small sound. Not surprise. They had come because they knew something would happen. People did not gather in heat like that unless shame was being served. Lydia kept her chin still. Frank said, "Ephraim, she is your blood. She was Harrow's concern for 2 years. They sent her back." Agatha Harrow stood near the church fence in a black dress, too fine for the heat. Her face was calm and pale under her bonnet. "My son is dead," Agatha said. "And she gave that house nothing before he passed." Nobody asked what kind of husband her son had been. Nobody asked whether a sick man and a cold marriage could be measured by a cradle that never came. Dry Bell did not like questions that made old families uncomfortable. Ephraim spoke louder. "A woman without a household cannot draw credit. A woman without children has no claim on church relief. That is the rule. It is not written anywhere." Miriam Bellwether said from the edge of the crowd. She was older, dull, and gray-haired. The only one who had stepped even half a foot forward. Ephraim did not turn. "Then write it." Frank Elders lowered the knife to the board. Lydia watched the blade scrape through her name. The sound was small. That made it worse. Chalk dust fell like pale ash. Lydia Vale disappeared from the board in 3 rough strokes. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not. Not for her father. Not for Agatha Harrow. Not for the children staring from behind their mother's skirts. Not for the men who looked away and listened harder. Frank stepped back. The board now showed only one thing beside the Vale line. Debt. Ephraim turned to the crowd. "She needs work. Any household that wants a strong pair of hands can speak to me." Lydia's mouth tightened. Not to her. To him. That was when the wagon stopped at the edge of the square. A man climbed down. He was tall, lean from work, and covered in trail dust. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow. His hat was plain. His boots were worn through honest use. Not show. Lydia knew his name only because Dry Bell knew every man who owned land within a day's ride. Garron Welles. Ash Creek Ranch. Weedover. 5 children. He crossed the square without hurry. The crowd made room because he did not look like a man who needed it made twice. He stopped in front of Ephraim Vale. "How much does she owe?" Garron asked. Ephraim looked him over. "This is family business. You put it on a public board." A few people shifted. Ephraim's jaw hardened. "She needs placement." Garron looked at Lydia then. Not at her hands. Not at her dress. Not the way men looked at a horse before bidding. He looked at her face. "I need someone at Ash Creek for 6 months." He said. "Household accounts. Pantry. Children's meals. Garden if there is still ground worth turning. Paid work. Written plain." Lydia did not answer at once. 5 children. She asked. Yes. You need a mother for them. No. He said. They had one. That answer struck the square quiet. Garron turned to Sheriff Cole, who had been standing under the awning of the jail office, pretending this was not his concern. Write it. Garron said. 6 months. Wages held in her name. She can leave with 1 week's notice. No debt to me. No payment to him. Ephraim's face darkened. Now wait, I am done waiting. Lydia said. Her own voice surprised her. So did the way the crowd looked at her. As if the name scraped from the board had spoken anyway. Sheriff Cole brought paper. Garron signed first. Then Lydia took the pencil. Her hand did not shake until she saw it. Near the bottom of the store ledger, under old relief names crossed out years ago, was another name scraped thin, but not gone. Lydia Vale. Her mother. Lydia stared at it. Garron noticed, but did not ask. She signed. Lydia Vale. Then she lifted her small canvas bag from the store step and walked toward Garron's wagon. Behind her, the credit board still held the scar where her name had been. But the pencil mark on the sheriff's paper was fresh. Ash Creek Ranch sat lower than Lydia expected. From the road, it looked as if the land had folded around it to keep the wind off. Cottonwoods marked the creek line behind the house, their leaves dull green from the heat. Beyond them, the pasture rolled toward low hills, dry at the edges but still alive in the middle. The house itself was solid, but tired. One porch rail leaned outward. A shutter hung crooked from an upstairs window. The kitchen garden near the side yard had gone brown, except for a few stubborn stems. The barn, Lydia noticed, looked better cared for than the house. That told her something. Garron Welles stopped the wagon beside the porch. Before he could speak, 5 children appeared at the rail. They stood in a line, though not a friendly one. The oldest boy was tall for his age, maybe 12. With sun-browned skin and a look that had already learned suspicion. Beside him stood a girl with dark braids and quiet eyes. A boy of 8 leaned against the post like he was trying to seem older than he was. A little girl with dust on her dress stared openly. Behind her, a smaller child peeked out, then hid again. Garron stepped down. These are my children. Lydia climbed from the wagon with her canvas bag in one hand. Thomas, Garron said, nodding to the oldest. Linny. Asa. Pearl. And that's June behind Pearl. June disappeared fully behind her sister. Lydia did not move toward them. Good afternoon, she said. No one answered. Pearl looked at Garron. Is she staying? For now, Garron said. That is not an answer. It is the answer I have. Thomas crossed his arms. Is she here to be mama? The words landed hard. Garron's face changed only a little. But Lydia saw it. The old wound was still close to the skin. No, Lydia said before he could answer. Thomas looked at her. You had a mother, Lydia said. I am not here to take her name. Linny's eyes sharpened at that. Pearl frowned. Then what are you? Lydia held her canvas bag tighter. Someone who can cook badly until I learn better. Asa almost smiled. Almost. Garron cleared his throat. Inside, the house smelled of dust, coffee, old smoke, and children. Not unclean, just worn down. Dishes sat stacked near the wash basin. A basket of mending leaned near the wall. So full, it had lost shape. The floor had been swept, but not scrubbed. The yellow curtains at the kitchen window were faded nearly white. Lydia looked once around the room and understood the truth. Garron had been trying. That made it sadder. He showed her a small room off the kitchen. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest too large for the space. It was storage, he said. I cleared it. It will do. I know it isn't much. Lydia set her bag on the bed. I have had less. Garron looked like he wanted to ask about that. He did not. Instead, he said, supper is usually at 6. Pantry is through there. Stove pulls hard on the left. Burns easy if you don't watch it. That is useful. The children know where most things are. That may or may not help me. For the first time, she saw something close to a smile move across his face. It was gone quickly. At supper, she made stew. It was not good. It was not terrible either. But it was thin where it should have been rich and salty in places that should not have been salty. The biscuits were a little dark on the bottom. Everyone sat around the table and looked at the food. Thomas spoke first. Mama's stew was thicker. Thomas. Garron said. Lydia lifted one hand slightly. He is telling the truth. Thomas looked surprised. I do not know how your mother made stew. Lydia said. I can learn. If someone is willing to show me. But I will not pretend this is the same. The table went quiet. Linny looked down at her bowl. She put cornmeal in near the end. Lydia nodded. Then I will remember that. Pearl took a bite and made a face. It is not the worst. Asa coughed into his sleeve. Garron looked at his plate like it required deep thought. Lydia almost laughed. But stopped herself. After supper, she washed dishes while Garron carried sleeping June upstairs. Pearl had fallen asleep with her cheek near her biscuit. Asa helped clear the bowls without being asked. Thomas left as soon as he was allowed. Linny stayed at the table, watching Lydia scrub the pot. You don't have to stand there. Lydia said. I know. Linny did not move. After a moment, she pointed toward the pantry shelf. Cornmeal is in the blue tin. Mama kept it there because June used to spill flour. Thank you. Lydia said. Linny shrugged and left. Lotta. When the house had gone quiet, Garron came into the kitchen with a leather account book in his hand. He set it on the table. Lydia looked at it. What is that? The ranch accounts. You are showing me. You are supposed to manage the pantry. Pantry does not stand apart from money. That was the first honest thing about the ranch he had given her. Lydia opened the book. She read the numbers twice. Feed. Bank note. Salt. Fence wire. Doctor fee. Seed. Interest. The margin was thin enough to cut a finger on. She looked up. Garron did not hide from it. Fall cattle sale should carry us. He said. If the pasture holds. Yes. And if the drought worsens. He did not answer. Outside. Somewhere beyond the house. Ash Creek moved faintly under the cottonwoods. Still running. But not strongly. Lydia closed the account book with care. Upstairs. One of the children turned in sleep. The house had 5 children. One tired man. A dying garden. And a bank note waiting like a shadow. Lydia had been taken off a credit board that morning. Now she was looking at a ranch that might soon be scraped off a map. By the 3rd morning, Lydia understood the stove. Not fully. Not enough to trust it. But enough to know the left side ran hotter. The back corner burned anything left alone too long. And the iron door had to be eased shut or smoke would push into the room and make June cough. That counted as progress. The children still kept their distance. Thomas came in only when called. Linny stayed near enough to see everything, and far enough to deny she was watching. Asa worked outside whenever Garron allowed it. Pearl followed Lydia from room to room and asked questions with no warning. June avoided her completely. If Lydia stepped into the kitchen, June stepped out. If Lydia sat on the porch, June went behind the rain barrel. If Lydia looked at her, June hid behind Pearl's skirt. Lydia let her. Some frightened things only moved closer when no one chased them. The garden was worse than the stove. The soil had dried into hard plates. Weeds filled the rows that had once been useful. Near the fence sat a small tin box with rust on the lid. Lydia found it half buried under a broken flower pot. Inside were seeds. Beans. Squash. A few herbs wrapped in paper. The labels were written in a careful hand that was not Garron's. Lydia held one packet between her fingers. Linny stood behind her. Quiet as a shadow. Those were Mama's. The girl said. Lydia put the packet back at once. I did not know. Linny crossed her arms. Are you going to throw them out? No. Are you going to keep them on a shelf like church flowers? No. Linny frowned. Then what? Lydia looked at the dead garden. I am going to see if any of them still know how to live. The next morning, Lydia went out before breakfast with a hoe. The ground fought her. Every strike jarred her wrists. The dry dirt broke in ugly chunks. Sweat ran down her back before the sun had cleared the roof. After an hour, she had opened one crooked row and blistered one palm. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard. A small hoe dropped beside her. Linny stood there with her braids tied tight and her face set. You're doing it too deep, she said. Lydia looked up. Good morning to you too. Mama did it shallower. Then show me. Linny picked up the smaller hoe and worked the row beside her. They did not talk much after that. They did not need to. By the end of the week, 3 rows were turned. By the second, there were 5. Pearl watered too much the first day and not enough the second. Asa carried buckets from the creek and pretended he was not proud when Lydia thanked him. Thomas watched from the barn. Garron watched from farther away. Then Pearl took sick. It came on at supper. One moment she was arguing that beans tasted better if mashed with biscuit. The next, her head was on the table and her face had gone pale. Lydia touched her forehead and went still. Garron, she said. He heard the tone and stood at once. That night, the house narrowed to Pearl's small room. A basin of cool water, folded cloths, and a lamp turned low. Garron brought what Lydia asked for. Water. More cloth. A clean cup. He did not crowd her. He did not argue. He stood in the doorway like a man waiting for a verdict. Pearl turned and muttered in her sleep. Lydia sat beside the bed and changed the cloth again. You have done this before, Garron said quietly. My mother was sick for years. Lydia said. A doctor was not always close. I'm sorry. Lydia looked at Pearl. So am I. Near dawn, the fever eased. Not all at once. Nothing kind ever came all at once. But Pearl's breathing settled. Her hands unclenched. She opened her eyes just enough to whisper. Biscuit. Lydia let out a breath she had not known she was holding. After you drink. Pearl frowned but obeyed. When the sun rose, Lydia stepped outside by the garden and stood with her back to the house. She did not cry long. Only enough to empty what the night had filled too high. The back door opened. Linny stood on the step. Pearl wants you, she said. Lydia wiped her face. For biscuits. And because she said your hand is cooler than Papa's. That was not much. It was everything. Lydia came back inside. As she passed the garden, she stopped. In the first row, a green hook had pushed through the dirt. Small. Bent. Alive. Thomas stood near the barn, looking at it too. He did not speak. But when Lydia went to fetch the flour, he stepped into the yard, picked up the water bucket, and carried it to the row without being asked. By late March, the salt was almost gone. Lydia had been stretching it for 2 weeks. Pinching less into stew. Saving the last clean measure for meat. Pretending the children did not notice. But children noticed everything. Especially children who had learned. Too early. That running out of things mattered. June also needed boots. Her left one had split at the toe. And every morning she tucked that foot under the chair, as if hiding it would mend the leather. So Lydia made the list. Salt. Coffee. Lamp oil. Needles. A small sack of flour if the price had not gone up. Boots for June. Garron read the list at the kitchen table and frowned. I'll go next week. You have the south fence down. It can wait. No. Lydia said. It cannot. And June's boot cannot wait either. Garron looked up. You do not have to go back to Drybell. I know. That town has a long memory. So do I. He turned the coffee cup in his hand. Slow and thoughtful. Take the good wagon. The bay horse. She pulls steady. I will. And if anyone says something you do not want to answer, you do not owe them your stillness. Lydia folded the list. I remember. At first light. She drove south. The road to Dry Bell was damp from last night's thin rain. The wheels cut dark lines through the mud. Spring had come in pieces. Not enough to heal the land, but enough to make the hills look less dead. Still. Lydia's hands tightened when the town appeared. Elder's Supply stood where it always had. The credit board still hung beside the door. Her eyes went to it before she could stop them. The scraped place where her name had been was still visible. Not clear. But not gone. Frank Elders looked up when she stepped inside. Mrs. Welles, he said. The name stopped her. No one at Ash Creek had pressed that name onto her. Garron had not even asked for it. But hearing it in Dry Bell, in that store, felt like standing on ground that had shifted beneath her and held. I need these, she said, handing him the list. Frank read it and began pulling goods from shelves. He did not speak of the square. That was one of the few good things about Frank. He cared more for numbers than gossip. She had just paid for the salt when a voice came from behind the fabric bolts. Well? Ephraim Vale's daughter. Lydia turned. Agatha Harrow stood in a gray dress with black gloves. Though the day was warm, her mouth held the same clean cruelty Lydia remembered. Mrs. Harrow. I heard Ash Creek took you in. Lydia lifted the flour sack into her arms. I work there. Work? Agatha said. A soft word for being collected by a widower with 5 children. Frank went still behind the counter. Lydia looked at Agatha fully. Garron Welles gave me wages. A room. And his honesty. That is more than some houses give their wives. Agatha's face tightened. You always did have a proud mouth for a woman with so little to show. Lydia felt the old wound stir. Then, to her surprise, it did not open. I have 5 children waiting for supper, she said. A garden coming up. A ranch account that still balances if we are careful. That will do for today. She took the parcel and walked out. On the porch, Miriam Bellwether waited with her hands folded. Lydia. Lydia stopped. Miriam's face had aged since that day by the board. Or maybe Lydia was only seeing her clearly now. I should have done more. Miriam said. You spoke. I stopped speaking. The street moved around them. A wagon passed. A child ran across the mud with a tin cup in hand. Lydia looked toward the credit board. Yes, she said. You did. Miriam nodded once, accepting the weight of it. Then Lydia said, but you are speaking now. Miriam's eyes filled, though she did not let tears fall. I am glad you found a place. Lydia adjusted the flour sack in her arms. I am still finding it. She bought June's boots from the cobbler and left town before noon. 2 miles from Ash Creek. A rider came fast from a side road. Tobias Crane. He owned land east of the creek and had been arguing with Garron over the access road since before Lydia arrived. He pulled his horse close enough that the bay tossed her head. Mrs. Welles, Tobias said, making the name sound like a joke. Move your horse. Just being neighborly. You are blocking the road. He smiled. Heard you went back to Dry Bell. Brave thing. After how you left. Lydia kept the reins steady. You mean after I signed my own name and rode away? His smile thinned. A woman can call it what she likes. Folks know Garron Welles was desperate. Lydia reached under the wagon seat and brought out the short-handled hatchet she used for kindling. She set it across her knees. Did not raise it. Did not threaten. Just let it be seen. I am going home, she said. You are in the road. Tobias looked at the hatchet. Then at her face. Whatever he saw there made him draw back his horse. Lydia clicked to the bay and drove on. Only when Ash Creek's fence came into sight did her hands begin to shake. Garron met her near the lane. One look at her face. And his own went cold. What happened? She told him. Not all at once. Just enough. When she said Tobias's name, Garron turned toward the barn. Lydia caught his sleeve. No. He blocked you. And I moved him. His jaw worked. He expected me to be afraid. Lydia said. I was not helpless. Do not make him more important than he was. Garron stood very still. The anger stayed in him. But he did not ride. That was not weakness. Lydia saw how much strength it took. Behind them, June came running from the porch in one old boot and one bare foot. Did you get them? Lydia looked at Garron. Then down at the small boots in the wagon. Yes. She said. I brought them home. The creek kept falling. At first. It was only something Lydia noticed when she went for water in the morning. A wet stone showing where water had covered it the day before. A strip of mud drying along the bank. Cottonwood roots showing like old fingers. Then the cattle noticed. They came slower to the troughs. They stood longer in the shade. Their ribs did not show badly yet. But Lydia had learned enough by then to know that trouble did not wait until it was obvious. So, she cut a cedar stake and drove it into the creek bed. Every morning. She marked the water line with Garron's pocket knife. First line. Second line. Third. By the end of the week. The space between the marks said more than any man wanted to hear. Garron stood beside her one morning. Hat low over his eyes. That creek has held through worse. He said. Maybe. He looked at her. Lydia did not soften it. Maybe not. The bank note from Linfield came 2 days later. It arrived folded in a dry envelope. Carried by a rider who did not stay for coffee. Garron opened it at the kitchen table after supper. Lydia watched his eyes move across the page. He read it twice. Then he set it down. When? She asked. 30 days. The children were supposed to be upstairs. But Thomas stood in the hall shadow. Lydia saw him before Garron did. Come in. She said. Thomas stepped into the kitchen. Garron looked at him. Tired enough not to scold. Is the bank taking the ranch? Thomas asked. No. Garron said too quickly. Lydia looked at the letter. Not if we act before they do. Garron's jaw tightened. We are not selling cattle early. We may have to. We sell early. We get less. We wait too long. We may lose the right to choose at all. The kitchen went still. Outside. The wind moved dry through the grass. Garron stood. I will not strip this place down because some bankman in Linfield wants clean numbers. Lydia's voice stayed calm. Clean numbers are how he takes dirty advantage. He turned toward her. She opened the account book and set it beside the letter. Here. She said. Feed costs. Salt. Fence wire. Doctor bill. Interest. If the creek keeps dropping. We buy feed by July. And then the cattle eat the note alive before fall. Thomas moved closer to the table. You can read all that? He asked. Yes. Garron looked at his son. Then at Lydia. The fight in him did not leave. It only changed shape. What are you suggesting? He asked. Sell part of the herd early. Not all. Enough to pay the note down before the bank decides we are scared. Repair the south fence with what remains. Dig the lower ditch deeper so the garden and near pasture live. That ditch will bring Tobias Crane to the door. He is already halfway there. No one answered that. The next morning. Asa found Lydia near the creek with a shovel. What are you doing? Losing an argument with dry ground. He picked up the spare shovel. Can I help it lose too? She looked toward the house. Your father said Papa is at the north pasture. That is not the same as permission. Asa shrugged. It is not the same as no. Lydia almost smiled. Small cuts only. We are guiding water. Not moving the creek. By noon. Linny brought water jars. Pearl carried twine. June came wearing her new boots and stood beside the cedar marker. Very serious. As if guarding it. Thomas arrived last. He held the account book under one arm. Papa said to bring this. He said. Lydia looked up. At the top of the hill. Garron stood by the fence. Watching. He did not come down. But he had sent the book. That evening, they made the cattle list. Garron named each animal slowly. Thomas wrote. Lydia counted the totals. Asa fell asleep at the table with his cheek on his sleeve. Linny carried June upstairs. Pearl kept asking whether selling cattle meant saying goodbye forever. Sometimes. Lydia said. Pearl frowned. That sounds sad. It is. Then why do it? Lydia looked at Garron. Because losing a few may save the rest. Garron did not speak for a long time. Then he nodded. 2 days later. Tobias Crane rode in with a folded notice from Dry Bell. He did not bother getting off his horse. Schoolhouse meeting. He said. Next Thursday. Folks want to talk about that ditch. Garron stepped off the porch. Folks. Or you. Tobias smiled. Water belongs to more than one ranch. Lydia stood in the doorway behind Garron. Tobias tipped his hat toward her. Maybe Mrs. Welles can bring her little stick and explain why Ash Creek needs more than its share. Garron's hands tightened. Lydia stepped past him before he could answer. We will bring the marker, she said. Tobias's smile thinned. And the account book, Lydia added. And the cattle list. And every receipt showing what this ranch has paid to stay alive. The yard went quiet. Tobias looked at Garron. You letting her speak for you now? Garron looked at Lydia. Then back at Tobias. She speaks for Ash Creek. Tobias did not like that. He turned his horse hard enough to throw dust. When he rode off, Garron stayed beside Lydia. The cedar marker stood by the creek below. Each knife line showing how fast the water had fallen. Lydia looked at it and felt the old fear rise. Not fear of Tobias. Fear of standing before a room and being erased again. Thomas came onto the porch behind her. If they ask who you are, he said quietly, tell them you're ours. Lydia turned. But Thomas was already looking away. Pretending he had said nothing important. Down by the creek. June's new boots stood beside the marker. Small and brown against the dry stones. The schoolhouse was too small for that much heat, and that many opinions. By noon, every bench was full. Men stood along the walls with their hats in their hands. Women gathered near the back. Children watched from the open windows. Quiet, because they knew something serious was happening. Even if they did not understand every word. Lydia stood beside Garron near the front table. On that table lay the account book. The cattle list. The bank letter from Linfield. And the Cedar Creek marker. The marker looked plain. Just a stake with knife lines cut into it. But to Lydia, it held the whole summer. Every drop lost. Every hard choice. Every morning she had gone down to the creek and hoped the water had not fallen again. Tobias Crane stood on the other side of the room. Clean-shaven for once. Wearing his best coat. That made him look less dangerous. But not more honest. He pointed at the cedar marker. That woman has been cutting ditches into a creek that feeds more than one spread. Tobias said. Ash Creek is weak. Everybody knows it. Wells cannot hold that ranch. So, now, he's letting her scrape water where she pleases. A few men muttered. Garron took one step forward. Lydia touched his sleeve. He stopped. That small stopping mattered. Sheriff Cole looked at Garron. You letting Mrs. Wells speak for the ranch? Garron looked at Lydia first. Then he turned back to the room. She already does. The schoolhouse went quiet. Lydia opened the account book. Ash Creek cut no new channel from the main creek. She said. We cleaned the lower ditch that has been on the property since Garron's father held the land. It waters the kitchen garden and the near pasture only. Tobias gave a short laugh. Convenient. Lydia looked at him. Yes. Water usually is. Someone near the back coughed to hide a laugh. She placed the receipts beside the book. We sold 23 head early. Not because the ranch failed. But because waiting would have given the bank power over us. The note is paid down. Garron set the stamped paper on the table. Paid. That word moved through the room without anyone saying it. Tobias's face changed. Only a little. But Lydia saw it. Agatha Harrow sat near the side wall. gloved hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were on Lydia. Sharp and cold as ever. So now, a woman with no children of her own, speaks for a ranch full of them. Agatha said. The room went still. Lydia felt the old words reach for her. Button. Liability. Nothing to show. Then, a chair scraped behind her. Thomas stood. He was tall now. Almost as tall as some men in the room. But his face was still young. She speaks for me, he said. Garron turned. Lydia did too. Thomas looked at Agatha. Then at the town board. And for Linny. And Asa. And Pearl. And June. His voice shook once. But he kept going. She stayed when Pearl was sick. She kept the garden alive. She read the bank numbers when none of us wanted to look. She made Papa sell before the bank could take us whole. He looked at Lydia. Then he said it. Mama knows Ash Creek better than most men in this room. No one moved. Lydia could not speak. Linny sat near the back with Pearl and June. Her eyes were wet. But her chin was high. Asa stared at Thomas like his brother had just done the bravest thing a man could do. Miriam Bellwether stood next. Her voice was quiet. But it carried. Dry Bell was wrong the day Lydia Vale's name was scraped from the board. I stood there and spoke once. Then stopped. I should not have stopped. Agatha looked away first. That was not an apology. But it was the first time her words had failed her. Sheriff Cole rested one hand on the table. The ditch stands. He said. The access road stays with Ash Creek. Tobias Crane has no claim unless he brings a deed stronger than talk. Tobias opened his mouth. Sheriff Cole looked at him. And if that road is blocked again, or that ditch is damaged, it will be written as interference against a working ranch. Tobias shut his mouth. Sheriff Cole turned to the clerk near the stove. Put it in the town record. The clerk opened the book and wrote it down. Lydia watched the pen move. Once, a name being scraped from a board had made her feel like she was disappearing. Now a road. A ditch. A ranch. And her place in it were being written where Dry Bell could not pretend not to see. When the meeting ended, people filed into the road quieter than they had entered. Some looked at Lydia with apology in their faces. Some did not look at her at all. That was fine. She had not come for their kindness. She had come to keep her home. Outside Elder's Supply. Frank Elders stood beside the same credit board where her name had been scraped away. Ephraim Vale stood a few feet off. Hat in hand. Looking older than he had that summer. Frank picked up the chalk. He did not ask permission. On a clean line near the bottom of the board, he wrote, Ash Creek Ranch, Wells and Vale. Paid account. Lydia looked at the words. Her father looked at them too. For a moment. Ephraim seemed ready to speak. Then he lowered his eyes. Lydia did not wait for the apology that might never come. She climbed into the wagon beside Garron. With the children crowded in the back and the cedar marker resting across Thomas's knees, they rode home under a red evening sky. Back at Ash Creek, the children ran ahead to the porch. June's boots thumped on the boards. Pearl carried the cedar marker like it was a flag. Asa shouted for Thomas to help him with the signboard by the barn. Garron stood beside Lydia near the gate. The old ranch sign hung crooked from one chain. Ash Creek Ranch. Weather had eaten the paint down to pale ghosts of letters. Garron lifted the sign from its hook and set it across two barrels. Thomas brought paint. Linny brought a brush. Pearl leaned over the board. Serious as a judge. Garron looked at Lydia. What should it say? Lydia looked at the house. The barn. The garden. The creek still low but still moving. Then she looked at the children waiting on the porch. Ash Creek Ranch, she said. Thomas frowned. That is already what it says. Lydia touched the worn wood. Then, write it better. Garron dipped the brush and painted the first word slowly. Ash Creek Ranch. Then he stopped. Thomas took the brush from him and added, Wells. He held the brush out to Lydia. No one spoke. Lydia looked at the wet black paint. Her name had been scraped off one board in Dry Bell. Now, no one was writing it for her. She took the brush and added the last word herself. Val. By dark. The sign was back over the gate. Ash Creek Ranch, Wells and Vale. Lydia stood beneath it with Garron beside her and June asleep against her shoulder. The creek moved softly in the dark. Not full. Not safe forever. But alive. And for that night. Alive was enough. If this trail stayed with you, leave your thoughts for Dust Trail Stories. Some homes are not given. They are built. One hard season at a time. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.